Hey everyone, I'm Mindy Wood from Our Inspired Roots, and I'm here with Amy Stross. For those of you who don't know Amy, she's a homesteader and blogger at 10thacrefarm.com and the author of the award-winning book, The Suburban Microfarm. Thanks for joining me today, Amy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as you know, Amy, permaculture gardening uses a holistic approach to dealing with pests and disease and weeds and things like that. But one of the strategies involved in that is using companion planting and plant guilds. So that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today. But before we jump into that, I'd like to hear a little bit about you and your homestead.
Okay, yeah, well, I love talking about gardening and homesteading. My journey in all of this started a little over 10 years ago. I was working as a high school teacher and I didn't feel like it was for me. And so I kind of branched out on my own. Started with some dirt therapy. I just kind of wanted to get my hands in the soil and kind of figure out what I wanted to do next with my life. And I didn't realize that the actual dirt therapy was going to be the thing that I did next with my life. But one thing led to another. I joined a board of people who managed a CSA, which you might know as a community supported agriculture program. So this was an organic farm. We were serving 150 local families with organic produce. And so I learned a lot about managing a program of that size and what it takes to grow food for that many people. I also got a job as a landscape gardener. So I was learning how to create, edible landscapes, pollinator-friendly landscapes, all kinds of ecologically friendly, interesting types of landscapes. And then, of course, I turned to my own yard where I was challenged with a small space, which is where the name of my blog comes from, 10th Acre Farm. I was on 1/10 of an acre. And, we had a lot of shade, poor soil, sloping land. And so I had to experiment with a number of different ways to grow food in that space. And throughout that journey, I came across permaculture. And I was able to take a permaculture design certification course. And that was really kind of mind-blowing. And everything that I've done since has sort of culminated around this collection of information and ideas that I learned in that permaculture course. And so today, well, actually all of that led to my blog, 10thacrefarm.com, as well as the book, The Suburban Microfarm. And today, actually, my husband and I are on 3 acres. And this is kind of a new homestead for us. We're actually breaking ground on the garden this year, but it's mostly wooded. So I feel like the information that I write about at 10th Acre Farm is really based around people who are growing food in residential spaces. And so even though we're on 3 acres, we're still gardening on a pretty small space. And I bet if I measured it out, it would not be more than 1/10 of an acre. So I feel like I'm sticking with that name. But yeah, that's a little bit about me and how I ended up here.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's so cool because so many people, I think, don't get into growing food because they're like, oh, well, I only have this tiny little yard. So it's so inspiring to hear that you've started growing food on 1/10 of an acre. Awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do in small spaces when you start looking for the tips and tricks that help you do that, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you explain companion planting and plant guilds, what they are, and then also, I'm not sure if you feel like they're different things. Maybe those two things have like slightly different meanings, and then why they're beneficial.
Sure. So this is sort of just my opinion. Like somebody else you ask might tell you a completely different answer. But this is my take on companion planting and plant guilds. For me, when I think of companion planting, I think of learning to use maybe one or two plants together that work really well. And, you know, I have a little section in my book about it. I know you can Google companion planting and find all kinds of different charts that list, you know, plant vegetables that work well together, or vegetables and herbs and things like that. What I think about companion planting is I think of it as the opposite of monoculture. And so when we look out at, you know, a giant field of corn, for example, that would be a monoculture. And what I like to do with my permaculture garden, because my goal is always to figure out how I can work with nature to grow a thriving garden, but also not do it at the expense of my local environment. And so when I think of companion planting, I think of it more as a polyculture, something that allows my my garden ecosystem to be a little bit more biodiverse. And there is some research on companion planting. Overall, I think that some of it is lore. Like, so for example, you might have heard of the book called Tomatoes. It's called Carrots Love Tomatoes. That's the name of the book. That's it's a very old book, but that was one of the first books that was written about companion planting. And I think what we've come to this point with companion planting is that some people have found a certain combination of plants that works, and then they share that with others, and then they try it, and either it works for them or it doesn't. And I think whether it works or not has to do with how much your conditions, your growing conditions, match the growing conditions of the person who had success with that combination. And so I don't think there's, because we're talking about plants and climate and soil and, you know, amount of rainfall and amount of sunlight, and those things are so variable from space to space that I don't think that we can say black and white, plant this with this in all situations. I think what we have to do as gardeners is learn to experiment and figure out what works for us. And so that is my long-winded answer about companion planting, and I totally do it in my garden. But I don't think of them as recipes. I think of them as sort of like guidelines, like, hey, try this and it, you know, might work for you. When I think of plant guilds, I think of it maybe as a next step up from companion planting. So with plant guilds, I kind of see them as mini ecosystems in and of themselves. So one of the most common types of plant guilds is a fruit tree guild, where we're planting a central thing, such as a fruit tree, and then we're creating a sort of mini ecosystem around that tree with plants that support its growth in one way or another. And we can get more specific about, you know, what those plants might do to help that fruit tree, for example. You know, it doesn't have to be a fruit tree. It can be anything, but we are looking at a larger system of plants that work together. And so again, it's just my opinion, but I think of plant guilds as many different plants growing together in a little ecosystem, whereas companion planting, I feel like we're usually talking about one or two, or you know, 2 to 3 plants that work together. So like a smaller plant guild.
That makes sense. Cool. And then why do you think that they are beneficial in the garden?
I think whenever we can bring in diversity to the garden, we are inviting nature in. And whenever we invite nature in, we are creating a more complex environment. So in that environment, we are allowing nature to do a lot of the work for us. And so when we have many plants growing together in a sort of polyculture or a companion plant type scenario or in a plant guild. Of course, we have the above ground parts that work well together. Some plants might bring in pollinators. They might have a strong scent that repel pests. They might be rich in a particular nutrient that feeds the soil of the plants around it. But then we have to look below ground. What are their roots doing together? These roots create a complex system that we might not have been able to replicate just by our own getting our hands in the soil and doing it ourselves. And so, those roots are creating an ecosystem below ground for us. And all of the insects that come in as a result of this little ecosystem we've created, we couldn't have, I couldn't have gone online and purchased, all of these different little insects that are coming to my garden. But here they are, they're attracted to this polyculture, and all I had to do was plant the plants, and then the ecosystem came. And so how that works to benefit our garden is, we're just creating a more, a healthier, more complex system with the help of plants and animals and soil organisms that kind of take over and make this, help our gardens have a life of their own.
Okay, awesome. And so how do you personally decide which plants to try planting together?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is experimentation, but I'll tell you, when I got started with this, because I learned about plant guilds in my permaculture design course, and that was back in 2009, so it's been a while. But one of the exercises we did in the course was our homework was to go out into the woods locally, take a walk, and look to see what plants are naturally growing together. And so I had this realization, because the one little park trail that I decided to go on for this homework exercise, I found wild ginger and wild geranium growing everywhere together. That was kind of like the main understory of this forest. And it was really pretty, but I could tell that it was a very rich and alive little ecosystem that had created around this, created around this sort of combination. And of course, I can't be sure exactly what little ecosystem it was creating, but they clearly liked growing with one another. And then I ended up taking that combination to my own garden. Although I don't use either of those for productive means, I had this really shady part of the part of my garden that I wasn't really able to grow, much of anything for, food, but I stuck a lot of, native shade plants there. And I ended up putting those two over there, and they just kind of thrived over there, and it was great. And I always found a lot of, there was just a lot of life there. I always found toads, lots of worms, a lot of the, birds would, hide under the leaves. I don't know, it just created a lot of habitat, and so I appreciated that. And that was my first experience with that. And so I went on to just do a lot of experimenting. So the first thing, I would do is take it slow. I would come up with an idea of some things that I thought would grow well together. And this is just me doing my own research, so anybody can do this. I would say, I've got this plant, let's say tomatoes, for example. And, what can I grow, with tomatoes? I want to bring in pollinators. I want to repel pests. Maybe something that might create a natural mulch, or enrich the soil, something like that. And so then I would just do a research, what kinds of plants provide those services, and then I would experiment with that. And so in that example, something that I tried was borage. Borage is an annual flower, and I'm sure you've heard of it, Mindy, or grown it yourself, but it has a very beautiful purple flower. I believe that its alternate name is bee bread. So I think bees really like borage, but it works really well with tomatoes. And so, I just gave that a try in my garden. And so again, this is really just about experimentation. And that's really how all of this got started for me. I just kind of became a detective, a very curious detective. What if I try this? Or rather, maybe not a detective, but maybe like a researcher. How would a researcher go about this? Let's try these two things together and see if they work. And if they do, awesome. I've got something that I can replicate. If not, let's try something else.
That's awesome. I just was thinking how you were talking about plants that you don't necessarily grow for food. And I think a lot of times people think like, oh, I'm not going to grow that because we don't eat it or I don't like it or whatever. But there are other uses for those plants, like you were talking about, like just planting them to attract the bees or to create a habitat for birds or whatever. So I'm really glad that you touched on that because I think that that is something that people a lot of times just overlook when we're just like really focusing on what we want to grow for ourselves. We forget about those things. So that's awesome.
Yeah, that's right. I really do feel like when we are thinking of our gardens as an ecosystem, we can think beyond and actually what we do to enrich the environment in other ways or the ecosystem, such as my little shade garden, those things end up helping the garden, as you were kind of alluding to. They enrich the garden in many ways. Just having the habitat for the the frogs and the toads that came by. I don't know. It's just a really nice support network for the garden.
Yeah. So this is a lot of information. So if you were telling someone who's just starting out, if you want to give them one piece of advice for using plant guilds or companion planting, what would you tell them?
I would say make sure to take it slow. There's a lot of things to think about here. So the first thing you want to do is observe. Like the experiment that I did when I was taking my permaculture course, anybody can do that. So you can go out into your local forest, or maybe you have a trail that goes through a meadow or a field, and you can kind of observe and see what is growing naturally. And maybe you see some combinations that you want to bring back to your garden, or maybe you just kind of use it as a way to think about how you might be able to replicate that with plants that you do prefer to use in your garden. So after that, I would just say experiment. Pick a few plants that you are excited to work with, because I think for me, all of this came about because I started to really fall in love with all of these plants. And so for me, there were certain plants that I was more excited to work with than others. And so why not take the plants that you're really excited about learning about, or that you already love, and figure out how to use those to your advantage in this type of mini ecosystem. And then run it like an experiment, see what happens. So, plant them together, and, if it works, awesome. You've got a great combination that you can replicate in other parts of your garden. And, if it doesn't, then you can try something else. But, the bottom line is to kind of have fun with it, and, not be afraid to experiment, and don't see a failure, don't see a failed experiment as a failure, because really it's just all about learning what's going to work best for you and your little ecosystem that you're creating, because what you're creating is unique to your garden. and it's, it's not something that, we can't all have the same garden. That's what's so beautiful about this hobby, activity, or lifestyle, however you want to look at this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today.
Yeah, this was really fun, Mindy. Thank you so much for having me.
Why don't you tell the viewers where they can find you?
Okay, so yes, I'm Amy Stross, and you can find me at 10thacrefarm.com. And actually, I have a little 10-day free mini course about permaculture there if you're interested. And then I'm also the author of The Suburban Microfarm. So you can find information about the Suburban Microfarm at thesuburbanmicrofarm.com.
Awesome. And can people buy your book on Amazon?
Yes, yes.
Awesome.
The book is available wherever books are sold, but you can definitely find it on Amazon.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mindy. This was great.
You can find the full version of this interview in our Inspired Roots Academy, which I'll link to in the description. OIR Academy offers monthly lessons to help you grow food right where you are. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.